On the morning of December 6, 1917, two ships collided in the narrows of Halifax Harbor. The Mont Blanc, a French cargo vessel loaded with wartime explosives, struck the Norwegian ship Imo. What followed was the largest human-made explosion before the atomic age, a blast that flattened nearly 2 square kilometers of the city and killed approximately 2,000 people. The explosion happened at 9:04 a.m. Those who survived described a moment of complete silence before the shockwave arrived. Windows shattered across the city. Buildings collapsed inward. The blast wave was so powerful that it bent iron rails and threw a half-ton section of the Mont Blanc's anchor more than 3 kilometers away. In the hours and days after, as rescue workers moved through the ruins, they began documenting what they found. Official reports from the Relief Commission, military engineers, and city officials provide a record of the immediate aftermath. These documents are available in the Nova Scotia Archives and Library and Archives Canada. They describe rescue operations, casualty counts, and the scope of structural damage. Photographs from the period show entire neighborhoods reduced to timber and stone. But these same records also contain something else: observations about what the explosion had exposed beneath the destroyed buildings. When structures were blown apart or burned to their foundations, older layers of construction became visible. Workers clearing debris found foundation stones that didn't match the buildings that had stood above them. They encountered timber pilings driven into the harbor floor decades earlier. They saw cross-sections of walls that revealed multiple phases of construction, renovation, and repair. The challenge in interpreting these findings lies in the nature of the disaster itself. The explosion didn't carefully excavate the city like an archaeological dig. It destroyed everything in a chaotic, violent event. Debris from different eras became mixed together. Buildings collapsed onto their own foundations, creating a confused mass of material from different time periods. Determining what belonged to which phase of Halifax's development required careful observation, and in many cases, the available documentation doesn't provide definitive answers. Contemporary accounts from engineers and cleanup crews mention these older features, but often in passing. A report might note, "Earlier foundation work encountered," or "Timber structures of unknown date found below grade level." These brief mentions suggest that workers recognized they were seeing evidence of earlier construction, but the urgent work of rescue and rebuilding left little time for detailed archaeological study. The photographs from the period show the scale of devastation, but they also capture these moments of exposure. In several images, you can see foundation walls standing alone, their upper structures completely gone. The stratification is sometimes visible: different types of stone, changes in mortar composition, evidence of modifications made over time. Other photographs show excavations for new construction in the months after the blast, where workers had to dig through layers of earlier building activity. What makes these records valuable is also what makes them incomplete. The explosion created a unique opportunity to observe Halifax's subsurface development, but it did so under the worst possible circumstances. The documentation we have comes from people focused on survival and recovery, not historical preservation. Their observations are real and useful, but they're fragmentary. Military engineers who helped with the cleanup produced technical reports about structural stability and reconstruction planning. Some of these reports reference older construction methods they encountered. They note differences in foundation depth, variations in building materials, and evidence of earlier street levels. These observations were incidental to their main work, but they provide glimpses of what lay beneath the pre-explosion city. The Relief Commission's records include inventories of destroyed buildings, assessments of property damage, and plans for rebuilding. Buried in these administrative documents are occasional references to complications caused by earlier construction: old cisterns that had to be filled, foundation walls that needed to be removed or incorporated into new buildings, subsurface voids that posed hazards during reconstruction. The cleanup operation began within hours of the explosion and continued for months. Thousands of workers, including soldiers, volunteers, and laborers brought in from other cities, worked to clear debris and make the area safe. Their task was immense. Entire streets had disappeared under collapsed buildings, and the winter cold complicated every aspect of the work. Reports from work crews describe what they encountered as they dug through the ruins. In the Richmond neighborhood, which took the worst of the blast, workers found foundation systems that extended deeper than expected. Some buildings had been constructed atop earlier foundations, reusing stone and timber from previous structures. This was common practice in 19th century construction, but the explosion exposed these reused patterns in ways that wouldn't normally be visible. Cleanup crews working near the waterfront encountered timber wharves and pilings that predated the structures above them. Halifax had been a working port since its founding in 1749, and the harborfront had been built and rebuilt many times. The explosion revealed this accumulated history in cross-section. Workers found layers of fill material used to extend the shoreline outward over the decades, creating more usable land for warehouses and docks. The city's newspapers during this period occasionally mentioned these findings. A January 1918 article in the Halifax Herald refers to foundations of considerable age, discovered during debris removal in the North End. The article doesn't specify what made these foundations seem old, and it doesn't pursue the question further. The focus quickly returns to reconstruction efforts and the needs of displaced residents. Engineering assessments from early 1918 discussed the challenge of building on ground that had been disturbed by the explosion. These reports note that excavation for new foundations frequently encountered earlier construction debris and structural elements of uncertain origin. In some locations, workers had to excavate more deeply than planned because the explosion had fractured older foundation systems, making them unsuitable for supporting new buildings. Photographs taken during the cleanup show work crews standing in excavated areas where multiple layers of construction are visible. In one widely circulated image, workers pose next to a partially exposed foundation wall that shows at least 3 distinct building phases, different stone types, variations in mortar, and evidence of modifications to the original structure. The photograph was taken to document the cleanup work, not to study the foundation itself, but it preserves evidence of Halifax's layered development. What workers found varied significantly by location. In areas closer to the original 18th century settlement, foundations tended to be older and more complex. Buildings had been constructed, modified, demolished, and rebuilt over 150 years. The explosion exposed this accumulated history, but the chaotic nature of the blast made it difficult to interpret the sequence of construction phases. Water and sewer crews working to restore city services encountered their own set of complications. Excavations for new pipes revealed older utility systems that weren't shown on current city maps. Some of these earlier systems were still partially functional. Others had been abandoned and buried when newer infrastructure was installed. The explosion had broken many of these older lines, and workers had to trace them to prevent leaks and contamination. The Halifax Explosion Relief Commission preserved some records of these infrastructure discoveries, but mainly in the context of utility restoration work. A March 1918 report mentions finding substantial stone-lined drainage channels of early construction beneath areas being rebuilt. The report notes these channels were incorporated into the new drainage system where practical, but it doesn't provide details about their age or original purpose. Personal accounts from workers add texture to the official records. Several men who participated in the cleanup later described finding intact cellars beneath collapsed building cellars that extended deeper than the buildings above them suggested they should. Some of these spaces contained materials and artifacts that appeared to predate the structures they were found under, though systematic collection of these items didn't occur. By spring 1918, the focus had shifted almost entirely to reconstruction. The temporary exposure of Halifax's subsurface history began to close as new foundations were poured and new buildings rose. Some engineers and surveyors recognized the historical value of what had been briefly visible, but preservation wasn't a priority in a city struggling to rebuild. Most of the exposed features were documented only incidentally, in photographs and reports created for other purposes. Understanding what the explosion revealed requires looking at what we know about Halifax before 1917. The city was founded in 1749 as a British military outpost, established to counter the French fortress at Louisbourg. From the beginning, it was a planned settlement, with surveyors laying out streets and allocating plots for military, government, and civilian use. The Nova Scotia Archives holds extensive collections of maps, surveys, and land records from Halifax's early decades. These documents show how the city developed from its initial grid of streets near the harbor. Early maps indicate the locations of fortifications, government buildings, churches, and residential areas. They provide a baseline for understanding the city's physical layout, but they have limitations. Maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries typically showed only major structures and property boundaries. Smaller buildings, temporary structures, and informal settlements often went unrecorded. This was particularly true in areas occupied by working-class residents, transit laborers, and those involved in harbor trades. The official record emphasized what mattered to colonial administration and military planning, not necessarily what existed on the ground. Property records offer another window into Halifax's development. Deed transfers, estate inventories, and tax assessments provide information about who owned land and what stood on it. These records show that many properties changed hands multiple times, with buildings being demolished, modified, or replaced as ownership transferred. A single plot might support several different structures over the course of a century. What these records don't always show is the physical reality of construction and reconstruction. When a building burned or was torn down, its foundation might be reused for the next structure. Cellars and basements were often retained because excavating new ones was expensive and labor-intensive. Timber pilings along the waterfront could support multiple generations of wharves and warehouses. This pattern of reuse means that what existed above ground didn't always correspond to what existed below. City directories from the 19th century list businesses and residents by address, providing snapshots of who occupied which buildings at specific times. These directories are useful for tracking changes in neighborhood composition and commercial activity, but they rarely describe the buildings themselves in detail. A directory might list a cooperage at a particular address in 1820 and a ship chandler's shop at the same address in 1850, but it won't explain whether the building was the same structure modified for new use or a completely new construction. Fire insurance maps, which became common in the late 19th century, offer more detailed information about building materials, dimensions, and uses. Halifax experienced several significant fires during its history, and insurance companies needed accurate information to assess risk. These maps show building footprints, construction materials, and the presence of hazardous operations like foundries or chemical storage. They're valuable resources, but they only exist for the period after their introduction, leaving earlier decades less well documented. Municipal records contain information about infrastructure development, sewers, water lines, street paving, and public works projects. These records show how the city expanded its services over time, but they often lack detail about what existed before new systems were installed. A report might note that a new water main was laid along a particular street in 1880, but it won't necessarily mention whether an earlier, informal water system was removed to make way for it. The other significant gap in the documentary record comes from simple loss. Halifax experienced fires in 1750, 1759, and other years that destroyed buildings and records alike. The provincial legislature building burned in 1819, taking with it many government documents. Records were also lost through neglect, administrative reorganization, and the general attrition that affects paper documents over time. What survives is valuable, but it represents only a portion of what once existed. Personal diaries and letters from Halifax residents provide occasional glimpses of daily life and the built environment. These sources are scattered across various archives and private collections. They offer details that official records miss: mentions of neighborhood characteristics, descriptions of particular buildings, observations about construction work or demolition. But they're fragmentary and cover only the experiences of literate residents who happen to preserve their writings. Newspaper archives are more systematic but come with their own constraints. Halifax newspapers from the 19th and early 20th centuries reported on major construction projects, fires, accidents, and civic developments. They're excellent sources for tracking when significant buildings were erected or demolished. However, coverage focused on notable events and substantial properties. Routine construction, modifications to existing buildings, and work in less affluent neighborhoods received less attention. Archaeological studies conducted in Halifax since the 1960s have added to our understanding of the city's physical development. Excavations associated with construction projects have revealed features not shown in historical documents: wells, privies, trash pits, foundation remnants, and artifact deposits that indicate where people lived and worked. These studies show that the documentary record has gaps, and that physical evidence can sometimes fill them. The challenge is that systematic archaeological work in urban contexts is expensive and time-consuming. It typically happens only when construction projects create the opportunity and regulatory requirements mandate it. Much of Halifax's subsurface history remains unexplored, visible only when accidents or disasters create unplanned exposures. When engineers and historians have examined evidence from the explosion's aftermath, they've had to work with incomplete and scattered information. The physical features that were briefly exposed in 1917 and 1918 are mostly gone now, buried again under the rebuilt city. What remains are the photographs, reports, and observations recorded during the cleanup period. Some researchers have focused on foundation systems visible in post-explosion photographs. These images show variations in construction techniques that suggest different building periods. Earlier foundations in Halifax often used local stone, granite, and slate quarried from nearby sites. The stone was typically laid in courses with lime mortar. Later foundations might incorporate brick or concrete, materials that became more common as the 19th century progressed and transportation networks improved. Analysis of these photographs has identified instances where buildings destroyed in 1917 sat atop foundations that appeared substantially older. The evidence includes differences in weathering patterns, variations in mortar composition, and changes in stone selection that suggest the foundations predated the structures above them by decades. This pattern makes sense given construction economics. Reusing a sound foundation was cheaper than excavating a new one. Historians examining waterfront areas have noted the complexity of harbor development. Halifax's shoreline was gradually extended through fill operations that created new land for commercial use. This process involved driving timber pilings, constructing cribwork, and depositing fill material: soil, gravel, construction debris, and ballast from ships. The explosion exposed sections of this accumulated shoreline, showing how the harbor edge had moved outward over time. Some interpretations of this evidence suggest that informal or temporary structures existed in areas that later became permanent neighborhoods. Wharves, warehouses, and workers' housing in port cities were often built quickly using available materials, then replaced or upgraded as economic conditions allowed. Physical evidence of these earlier phases might exist in foundation remains and fill deposits, but distinguishing them from later construction requires careful analysis. The difficulty is that the explosion didn't create ideal conditions for such analysis. The blast mixed materials from different periods, broke apart structural elements, and scattered debris widely. Workers clearing the area prioritized safety and efficiency over archaeological precision. Foundation stones that might have told a clear story about construction sequence were often removed and reused or simply hauled away as debris. Some researchers have examined water and sewer systems exposed during the cleanup. References in engineering reports to substantial stone-lined channels and drainage systems of early construction suggest infrastructure that predated the city's documented sewer system. One possibility is that these were private drainage solutions, channels built by property owners before municipal services existed. Another is that they represent earlier, informal systems that were later replaced but not completely removed. The challenge in interpreting this evidence is the limited context. A stone-lined channel found beneath a destroyed building could be a purpose-built drain from the 18th century, or it could be a natural watercourse that was later channeled and incorporated into the urban fabric, or it could be part of a 19th century improvement that simply wasn't well documented. Without detailed archaeological context, multiple interpretations remain possible. Artifact evidence from the explosion's aftermath is sparse. The focus on rescue and reconstruction meant that objects found during cleanup were rarely preserved systematically. Some items ended up in museums or private collections, but without careful documentation of where they were found and in what context. This limits their value for understanding the city's layered development. Researchers have also considered what the explosion revealed about building density and neighborhood organization. Photographs show that in some areas, structures were built extremely close together, sharing walls or separated by narrow alleyways barely wide enough for a person to pass through. This density suggests organic growth rather than planned development, with buildings added incrementally as space and resources allowed. The question of earlier settlement patterns remains open to interpretation. Some historians have suggested that certain areas of Halifax might have supported structures or activities that left minimal documentary traces: seasonal fishing camps used by indigenous peoples before European settlement, temporary military encampments from the founding period, or informal shanty towns occupied by laborers and transient workers. The explosion might have exposed evidence of such occupations, but the chaotic nature of the disaster and the lack of systematic documentation make definitive conclusions difficult. What seems clear from available evidence is that Halifax in 1917 sat atop multiple layers of earlier construction. Buildings had been built, modified, demolished, and replaced over 168 years. Infrastructure had been installed, upgraded, and sometimes abandoned in place. The shoreline had been extended and reshaped. Neighborhoods had grown, declined, and been redeveloped. The explosion created a brief window into this accumulated history, but interpreting what was visible through that window requires acknowledging significant limitations in both the contemporary documentation and our current understanding. More than a century has passed since the Halifax explosion, and many questions about what it revealed remain unresolved. The foundations, drainage systems, and construction features that became visible during the cleanup are now buried again beneath the modern city. The photographs and reports from 1917 and 1918 preserve fragments of what was seen, but they don't provide complete answers. Part of the limitation is simply the nature of historical documentation. Records were created for specific purposes: rescue operations, reconstruction planning, insurance claims, property assessments. When engineers noted earlier foundation work encountered, or structures of uncertain date, they were making observations relevant to their immediate task, not conducting historical research. Their notes are valuable, but they weren't designed to answer the questions we might ask now. Another limitation is the disaster itself. Archaeological understanding depends on context, knowing where objects and features were found, what was around them, and how they relate to other evidence. The explosion destroyed that context violently and chaotically. Materials from different periods became mixed. Structural relationships were obliterated. What remained was a confused mass that resisted clear interpretation even at the time, and becomes more difficult to analyze with each passing year. The documentary gaps also matter. We know that Halifax experienced fires, administrative changes, and simple record loss over its history. What survives in archives represents only part of what once existed. Buildings that appear suddenly in a city directory might have been preceded by other structures that went unrecorded. Infrastructure that seems to emerge fully formed might have evolved from earlier, informal systems that left no paper trail. The absence of documentation doesn't prove these earlier phases existed, but it doesn't prove they didn't either. This creates space for different interpretations, and it's worth acknowledging that interpretations can vary based on which evidence is emphasized and how gaps in the record are understood. Some historians lean toward conservative readings, accepting documented facts and remaining cautious about speculating beyond them. Others are more willing to infer probable patterns based on what's known about urban development in similar cities during comparable periods. Both approaches have merit, and neither can claim complete certainty. What the explosion demonstrated clearly is that cities are palimpsests, layered documents where earlier writing shows through beneath later text. Halifax in 1917 wasn't simply the city visible on the surface. It was built atop and incorporating elements from earlier versions of itself. Foundations were reused, infrastructure was overlaid, neighborhoods grew through accretion rather than comprehensive planning. This is normal urban development, but it's usually hidden beneath streets and buildings. For researchers interested in Halifax's history, the explosion created both an opportunity and a problem. The opportunity was that brief period of exposure when subsurface features could be observed and documented. The problem was that the circumstances made systematic study nearly impossible. What we're left with is a collection of observations, some detailed, many fragmentary, that suggest complexity without fully explaining it. The value in examining this evidence isn't necessarily in reaching definitive conclusions. It's in recognizing that historical understanding is built from imperfect sources and always remains provisional. New discoveries can change interpretations. Different analytical approaches can yield different insights. Questions that seem settled can be reopened when fresh evidence emerges or when familiar evidence is examined from new perspectives. For anyone interested in exploring these questions further, the primary sources are accessible. The Nova Scotia Archives holds photographs, reports, and documents from the explosion and its aftermath. Library and Archives Canada has additional materials, including military and federal government records. Local historical societies maintain collections of personal accounts and community memories. These sources don't answer every question, but they allow for direct engagement with the evidence rather than relying solely on others' interpretations. Looking at historical photographs from the cleanup period can be particularly revealing. Details visible in these images weren't necessarily what the photographer intended to document, but they're nonetheless foundation walls showing multiple construction phases, exposed drainage systems, variations in building materials and techniques. Each photograph is a record of a specific moment when something usually hidden became briefly visible. The broader lesson from the Halifax explosion and what it exposed isn't unique to that city or that event. Disasters, construction projects, and infrastructure work regularly reveal aspects of urban history that aren't apparent from surface observations or documentary records alone. Each revelation is an opportunity to refine understanding, but also a reminder of how much remains unknown about the places we inhabit. What happened in Halifax in December 1917 was a catastrophe that caused immense suffering and loss. The historical questions it raises are secondary to that human cost. But those questions remain worth examining not because they lead to certain answers, but because the process of careful observation and thoughtful interpretation is valuable in itself. It encourages attention to evidence, humility about what can and can't be known, and openness to continued inquiry as new information becomes available. The city that exists now sits atop all those earlier layers: the city of 1917, the city of 1867, the city of 1800, the settlement of 1749, and possibly traces of human activity that preceded European colonization. Each layer is part of the story, even when the evidence is incomplete and the documentation has gaps. Understanding that complexity, and accepting the limits of what can be definitively known, is part of understanding Halifax itself.